Here is a thing I never noticed until embarrassingly recently, considering how many hours of this show I have sat through. Regular Show does have a theme song. It ran for 8 years, it ran for well over 200 episodes, it had one of the most recognisable soundtracks on television at the time, and at no point in any of that did anyone sit down and write it a theme tune. What you get instead is a noise, a sort of blurred warbling sound that J.G. Quintel made with his own mouth, followed by a ticking clock over the title card, and then you are in the episode. That's it. That's the whole opening. 8 seasons of a show that couldn't be bothered to introduce itself. I love that more than I can properly explain. Every other cartoon of that era had a song you could sing at a party 20 years later. Regular Show had this distorted, low-pitch intro sound instead. And somehow it worked, because the show was never really trying to announce itself. It just started the same way a Tuesday just starts. So that's where we're going tonight. The whole thing. All of it. Where this show came from, which is a much stranger and much more specific story than most people realise. And where it ended up, which is stranger still, because it ended up in a place that most shows never get to go. We're going to talk about a kid in a flat, boring town in Central California who was given a video camera and made films with Lego men. We're going to talk about 2 student films that almost nobody was supposed to see, one of which is genuinely not appropriate for children in any way, and both of which contain characters you have known since you were small. We're going to talk about the gumball machine, the Yeti, the ghost, the lollipop, and the raccoon that was originally just a doodle on a post-it note. We're going to talk about how a member of Devo ended up writing music for a Cartoon Network show. We're going to talk about the movie, where a volleyball coach nearly deletes time. We're going to talk about the ending, which I still think about, and which quite a lot of people are still annoyed about, and I think both of those reactions are completely reasonable. And then, because you clicked on a video that says the word theories in the title, we're going to sit with the theories. The drug one, the year 2005 one, the one about what High Five Ghost actually is, which nobody has ever satisfyingly answered, and the big one, the one about what the park really is and who's really watching, which got a lot more interesting about 2 months ago, for reasons we'll get to right at the end. Because that's the other thing, this isn't a eulogy. The show came back. There's new Regular Show on television, as I'm recording this, which is a sentence I genuinely did not expect to say in my 30s. If you like this sort of thing, subscribing helps me out a fair bit. That's the whole pitch. No pressure at all. Right, let's start with the town. James Garland Quintel was born in Hanford, California, to Terry and James Allen Quintel. I want to spend a minute on Hanford because it explains more than any interview quote ever could. Quintel's own description of the place is that the geography is kind of flat, and that there was not a ton to do when he was growing up. That's it. That's the summary of an entire childhood. Flat and nothing happening, and because there was nothing to do, he and his friends spent their whole adolescence inventing things to do, making their own entertainment out of a town that wasn't offering any, finding ways to fill hours that didn't want to be filled. He has said outright that he later put those kinds of misadventures into Regular Show. So when you watch 2 lads in a park invent an elaborate competition about who has to take the rubbish out, and then that competition summons something from another dimension, you are not watching a random cartoon premise. You are watching a very specific memory of being bored in Central California, dressed up in fur and feathers. I find that genuinely lovely. Most shows are built out of other shows. This one was built out of a flat town. In 1998, when he was 16 and a sophomore at Hanford High, his dad gave him a video camera, and this is where you can see the whole career starting to switch on, because he didn't use it to film his mates messing about. He used it to make stop motion, a few minutes of animation at a time, built out of Lego men and crude paper cutouts, for short film projects at school. Think about the patience that requires. Stop motion is the least fun way to make anything. It's move the arm, take a frame, move the arm, take a frame, for hours, to get about 2 seconds. A 16-year-old choosing that over literally any other use of a camera tells you exactly what kind of person we're dealing with. He filled out the rest of his education in a way that I think is quietly telling. He took an AP literature class. He took a pottery class. He took a summer course where he learned how to animate films and make flip books. That's not the CV of a kid who wanted to be famous. That's a kid trying to figure out how to make things with his hands. He also worked at a movie theatre and, in his words, at a lot of minimum wage jobs, which matters because Mordecai and Rigby work for minimum wage at a park. That is stated flatly in the show's premise. They're not adventurers who happen to have jobs. They're two lads on a rubbish wage who occasionally have to fight a demon on their lunch break. The park isn't a setting, it's a workplace. And the reason it feels like a real workplace is that the man who wrote it had done a stack of jobs exactly like it. This is my favourite thing about Regular Show, and I'll probably say it again in a slightly different way later, so I'll keep it short here. The show is not about slacking off. Slacking off is the plot. The show is about being in your early 20s, being broke, and being stuck somewhere flat where nothing is happening, and deciding that you're going to have a good time anyway, out of pure stubbornness. That's not a cartoon premise. That's a lifestyle. Quite a lot of us have lived in it. In May 2000, he was nominated as a 12th grade California academic all-star from Hanford High, which is a nice little detail that undercuts the whole slacker mythology. The man was not a slacker. He was, by all appearances, a hard-working kid who really liked drawing. After high school, he didn't go straight to art school. He went to College of the Sequoias, and then College of the Canyons, community colleges, building up a portfolio. Because here is the part that I think gets skipped in every version of this story that gets told. He was rejected from Cal Arts first. He didn't sail in. He got told no, went away, got better, and came back. I think about that whenever anyone talks about this show, like it was some effortless slacker fluke. Now, since we're talking about what was in his head at the time, we should talk about what he was actually consuming, because it's all sitting there in the finished show, if you know where to look. Growing up, he was inspired by The Simpsons and Beavis and Butthead, which, yes, obviously, two guys on a sofa making terrible decisions and laughing at each other is a lineage that goes straight back to Beavis and Butthead. And the naturalistic family sitcom rhythm underneath the surreal stuff is very Simpsons. He also credits the stylistic elements of Joe Murray's Rocko's Modern Life and Camp Lazlo as working their way into his style. If you've ever wondered why Regular Show characters are drawn with that particular slightly rubbery, slightly ugly on purpose confidence, that's your answer. That's the Rocco School of Design, where everybody looks a bit wrong and it's funnier for it. And then the video games, which I think are the most underrated influence of the lot. Street Fighter, Shadowrun, and Toe Jam and Earl, which he played as a child, and which he later described as the perfect platform for Mordecai and Rigby. Here's a fun detail for anyone who never played it. Toe Jam and Earl is a Sega Mega Drive game about two mismatched aliens wandering around a low-stakes randomly generated world, mostly just faffing about and occasionally getting chased. One of them is tall and lanky and slightly more sensible. One of them is short and round, and absolutely not. They have an urgent mission. They are just two mates in a weird place. That's Mordecai and Rigby. That is completely, unmistakably Mordecai and Rigby, and Quintel said so himself. The blueprint for one of the biggest cartoon double acts of the 2010s is a Sega game from 1991 about two aliens bumbling around a floating island. I don't know why that delights me as much as it does. Maybe because it means the show's DNA is genuinely just the stuff a bored kid in a flat town liked, with no grand plan behind any of it. He liked a game. He liked a cartoon. He was skint and worked bad jobs. 20 years later, that's a television series. But now, let's talk a little about what happened when he finally got into that art school. Because this is where the show technically already exists, without anyone knowing it yet, sitting in 2 short films that were never meant to be anything. Right, so CalArts. Before we get to what he made there, I want to tell you how he made it, because it's the single most charming fact in this entire origin story, and I have been waiting to say it. At CalArts, Quintel and about 20 fellow students had a game. Well, game is doing some work there. It was a system. It was called the 48-hour film project, and the way it worked was this. Everybody would write words on bits of paper and chuck them into a hat. Words like lollipop, words like candy. Then at midnight, someone would pull one word out of the hat, and you had a weekend to build an entire animated short around whatever that word was. That's it. That's the process. Random noun, midnight, go. And I want to be very clear about what this means, because I don't think it registers properly the first time you hear it. 2 of the most recognisable characters in modern animation, characters that millions of people have loved since childhood, exist because somebody wrote a word on a scrap of paper and dropped it into a hat in a room full of art students at midnight. Not a pitch document, not a focus group, a hat. One of the students in that group, by the way, was Sam Marin, who we'll be talking about a lot more later, because he ended up voicing about a third of the cast. So, the first film. In the spring of 2005, that process led Quintel to make a short animated film about an ambassador who loses his cool during a completely benign encounter. He called it The Naive Man from Lollyland. That's the whole premise. An ambassador from Lollyland gets into trouble when he naively tries to pay for a harmless encounter with his region's currency, lollipops. A dignified little chap from a place called Lollyland comes to the United States as an ambassador, has an interaction that is not remotely a big deal, and completely comes apart over it. And the ambassador, obviously, is Pops. That's Pops. Fully formed, essentially, right there in 2005, years before anyone had thought of a park or a gumball machine or a raccoon. The lollipop head, the refined little manner, the absolutely fathomless naivety. The bit where the polite exterior gives way and something much stranger comes out. The film did well. It won both the Producer's Choice Award and the Student Animator Award at the 2005 Nicktoons Film Festival. Actual prizes, actual money, actual software, and it got him noticed by Fred Seibert, who called Quintel an original talent to watch out for in the future, which is one of those quotes that must be very satisfying to have said in hindsight. His hometown paper, the Hanford Sentinel, listed it as one of 2005's moments from a memorable year, which I find weirdly moving. The local paper in the flat town where nothing happens, noting that one of theirs had done something. He graduated in December of 2005 with a BFA in character animation. Now the second film. And this one is a different animal entirely. It's called 2 in the AM PM, and it's about 2 clerks working the night shift at an AM PM, which is an American chain of convenience stores attached to petrol stations that stay open all night. It's Halloween. One of the clerks offers the other a piece of candy. The candy is laced with acid, though he tells his mate it's laced with something considerably milder. And then the 2 of them proceed to hallucinate some genuinely upsetting things for the rest of the short. The 2 clerks are voiced by Trey Parker. They are also drawn to look like Quintel and Sam Marin. It's basically the 2 of them, voicing animated clerks based on themselves, in a film with a lot of swearing in it. And during the hallucination sequence, you see Mordecai and you see Benson. I need to be really precise about this next bit because it is the seed of about half the fan theories we'll get to later, and because the precise version is more interesting than the loose version anyway. Mordecai and Benson are not characters in that film. They are not people who exist in that story. They are what two blokes on acid at a petrol station see when the acid kicks in. That's their entire function. They are hallucinations, and the show that came later took those designs and gave them jobs and a life and a boss. The short went to the 30th annual Spike and Mike's Sick and Twisted Festival of Animation in 2007, which should tell you the register. Spike and Mike's is not where you take your gentle student work about grief. There's no version of 2 in the AM/PM that airs on Cartoon Network. It's got the language, it's got a bit of nudity, and it plays out like what regular show would be if it had been made for adults with no restrictions at all. Rigby isn't in it, because Rigby didn't exist yet. Quintel and Marin were the double act, so the pairing at the heart of that film isn't Mordecai and Rigby, it's Mordecai and Benson, which is a fascinating thought if you sit with it for a second. In the original configuration, the two clerks were mates on the same shift, going through the same night together. Fun fact that I think is genuinely one of the best in the whole story. While hallucinating, the Marin character, who looks like Benson, worries about getting fired. He's off his head at a petrol station in the middle of the night, and the anxiety his brain produces is about work. Benson's entire personality, sitting there fully formed in a student film, as a drug-induced panic about employment. I want to say something honest here, and I'll come back to it properly much later on when we do the theories bit. The people who insist regular show is secretly about drugs are not making that up out of thin air. That's a real film. That really happened. Mordecai and Benson genuinely did begin their lives as hallucinations. Anyone who tells you that theory is baseless hasn't watched the source material, but the premise being real doesn't make the conclusion right, and we'll get into why. For now, I just want it on the record that this isn't people seeing shapes in clouds. There's an actual object at the bottom of it. While all this was going on, he was also meeting the people who'd shape the next decade of Cartoon Network. He crossed paths at CalArts with Pendleton Ward, who would go on to create Adventure Time. So the two shows that essentially rebuilt Cartoon Network in the 2010s were made by two blokes who knew each other at art school, which is either a testament to CalArts or a testament to how small this industry actually is. And I honestly think it's both. There's one more thing from the CalArts years worth mentioning, because it quietly determined what kind of career he'd have. Quintel has said that the program deepened his understanding of animation as a medium, but that it shifted him away from pure animation and towards storyboarding and directing, once he properly recognised how labour-intensive frame-by-frame work is. Which, having just told you he spent his teenage years doing stop-motion with Lego men, feels like the punchline to a joke that took 8 years to land. He learned animation, got very good at animation, and then concluded that animating is a nightmare, and he'd rather be the one deciding what happens. I don't say that as a criticism, I say it because it's exactly right. The thing Quintel is world-class at is not moving a drawing. It's knowing what's funny, and knowing what shape a scene should be, and knowing when to let a moment sit there and go on slightly too long. You don't need to be an animator for that. You need to be a director. He had the designs, he had the awards, he had a degree. He did not, at this point, have a show, or any particular reason to think he'd ever get one. But now, let's talk a bit about the job he took next, because it's where he learned how to actually run a thing. The first proper foot in the door came in 2004, and it came as an internship. Cartoon Network Studios, working on Star Wars, Clone Wars, which is a lovely bit of trivia on its own, that the man who made regular show got his start on Star Wars, in a building where Mark Hamill would eventually turn up to play a Yeti. Nobody planned that. It just happened. After graduating, he passed a test and started working as a storyboard revisionist on Camp Laszlo. Storyboard revisionist is one of those job titles that sounds grander than it is. You are broadly the person who fixes other people's boards. It's not glamorous. It is, however, an extremely good way to learn what works, because you spend all day looking at things that don't. Then came Flapjack, and this is where he properly levelled up. He served as creative director on Thurop Van Orman's The Marvellous Misadventures of Flapjack, and in 2009 he was nominated for an Annie Award for directing an episode of it. If you've never seen Flapjack, I genuinely recommend it, though be warned that it is one of the strangest things Cartoon Network has ever put on air. It's a show about a boy and a whale and a pirate, and it looks like it was drawn by someone who was slightly unwell, which I mean as high praise. It's got teeth, it's got a bit of rot in it, and it was a factory for talent. Van Orman ran it, Quintel was creative director on it, Pendleton Ward worked on it. Many of the shows that defined the following decade came out of that one production office. Now, the Cartoon Institute. Around the second season of Flapjack, there was an executive changeover at Cartoon Network. Rob Sausher came in as Chief Content Officer, and he was looking to push the network to be a little bit older. And as part of that, they made the Cartoon Institute, which was a shorts program where artists could make pilots without notes and without focus testing. Let me repeat that middle bit because it's the important one. Without notes. A television network voluntarily, deliberately, deciding to leave people alone and see what happens. That does not happen. That basically never happens. And the fact that it happened once, briefly, at Cartoon Network, at exactly the moment a group of extremely talented weirdos were all in the same building, is the reason a whole generation of cartoons exist. Quintel's routine was direct. He sent Sausher 2 in the AM/PM. His pitch, essentially, was that he wanted to make something like that. The vibe of it, the intensity of the surreal nature of it, and how far that could be pushed, which is a bold move. That's the film with the acid and the swearing, sending it to the man who runs the network and saying, "More of this, please," but for television. And it worked, which tells you something about the moment. Quintel's own line about it, looking back years later, was that he was surprised the show was greenlit given how weird the content was, and that it was just making them laugh. When I think back on those days, I'm like, how did they greenlight it? Some of the stuff they were doing was so weird, but it was making them laugh. The Cartoon Institute produced exactly 2 greenlit series. Regular Show was one, the other was Secret Mountain Fort Awesome, which was based on the Cartoon Institute Short Uncle Grandpa, which then went off and became its own series later. The Cartoon Institute itself was eventually scrapped and never premiered on television, so the programme that produced Regular Show doesn't exist and never aired. It got cancelled and left behind 2 shows and a shrug. That's very funny to me, and also very sad, in the way that a lot of good things at big companies are. Now here is the fact from all my digging that stopped me dead, and I don't think enough people know it. Regular Show was originally going to be set at a zoo. Not a park, a zoo. And here's the twist, which is the part that makes it genuinely mad. In this version, the animals in the enclosures were going to be humans, and the keepers looking after them were the animals. So Mordecai and Rigby would have been zookeepers, keeping humans in cages. That was the concept. And Rob Sausher's one big note on that initial early pitch was to get rid of it. I go back and forth on this. Part of me desperately wants to see that show. There is a version of that idea that is genuinely brilliant and quite dark, but I think Sausher was right. And I think he was right for a reason that took 8 years to fully reveal itself. Because the zoo idea is a concept, it's a hook, it's clever. And Regular Show is not clever in that way at all. Regular Show is a show where 2 blokes work at a park, and the entire joke is that the park is boring and normal and their lives are mundane, and then a demon shows up. If the setting is already high concept, The mundane bit doesn't exist. You've got nothing to fall away from. The surreal stuff only lands because the ground underneath it is so ordinary. You can't have "these guys are just trying to have a normal day" if the premise is that humans live in cages. The whole engine breaks. So the note that most people would tell you as an example of network interference ruining an artist's vision is, in this case, the note that made the show work. I don't get to say that very often, so I'm enjoying it. The series was greenlit on the 13th of August, 2009. It debuted at 8:15 in the evening on the 6th of September, 2010. And the direction from the network was clear from the start. They told Quintel they wanted to age it up from the TVY7 material they'd been doing. So the show landed at TV PG, and the crew leaned into more adult-oriented humour, light vulgarity, and references to alcohol. Which is why, if you were 9 or 10 when this show started, it felt slightly illicit. It wasn't. It was a Cartoon Network show, but it had pissed in it, and characters who were clearly hungover, and a sort of tiredness in the writing that no other cartoon aimed at kids had. It felt like being allowed to sit at the adults' table. But now, let's talk about who was actually at that table. Because the way this cast got assembled is not the way you'd think. I want to start this bit with Quintel's own explanation for how the main cast came together, because it is so unromantic that it circles all the way back round to being romantic. He was recycling. That's it. That's the reason. His logic, in his own words, was that it takes a long time to find new characters, and he'd spent about a year on each of those student films. So he looked at what he already had and thought, I really like those character designs, and I want to use them again. They'd done well at school. People were laughing at them at screenings. So in his words, these characters work, I want to put them together. He had Mordecai, he had Pops, he had Benson, and that wasn't enough for a show. So he made up Rigby to be a friend for Mordecai. And then for the rest of them, he went poring through his sketchbooks, finding things he thought were funny, and piecing them together until it felt like, in his phrasing, oh yeah, this feels like the crew. Now, read that back and notice what's missing. There's no theme. There's no unifying logic. Nobody sat down and asked why a gumball machine would be managing a Yeti. He had a folder of drawings he liked, and he shoved them into a room together and checked whether the room felt right. And Quintel knows this, and says so, which is the part I find genuinely brilliant. He's admitted that this is why it kind of feels a little bit pushed together. Mate, that's the show. That's the entire aesthetic. He's describing the single most distinctive quality of his own work as an accident, almost apologetically. Because the reason the regular show cast is so memorable is precisely that it makes no sense. It looks like a bin. There is no world in which a blue jay, a raccoon, a gumball machine, a lollipop, a yeti, a green man, and a ghost with a hand growing out of his head are a coherent design language. They look like they've been assembled from 4 different shows, and that's why you can pick any one of them out of a lineup instantly, because none of them share a grammar with any of the others. If a design department had built that cast on purpose, they'd have smoothed it. They'd have found the through line, and it'd have been forgettable. Right, Rigby, my favourite origin of the lot because it's the least. Quintel drew a raccoon hula hooping. That's what happened. He was doodling, and he drew a raccoon with a hula hoop on a post-it note. He liked the design, and so he developed the character from it, deciding he'd be far less responsible than his companion. One of the 2 leads of a show that ran for the better part of a decade is a doodle of a raccoon with a hula hoop. Nothing further. That's the story. There is no deeper version of it. Mordecai, meanwhile, is Quintel, and I don't mean loosely. He said it directly. The character of Mordecai embodies him during his college years, specifically at Cal Arts, and his description of what that meant is one of the best summaries of being 20-something I've ever read from anyone, let alone a cartoonist. That's that time when you're hanging out with your friends and getting into stupid situations, but you're also taking it seriously enough. That's the bit. That's exactly the tension the whole show runs on. These lads are messing about, but they are not trying. They care. They care about the video game. They care about winning the argument. They care enormously about things that do not matter, which is precisely what your early 20s are. And it's why the show has aged so well. Because that feeling doesn't date. The rest of them are lovely little bits and pieces. Muscle Man's actual name is Mitchell Sorenstein, which almost nobody remembers, and I include myself in that. 25 years old, 5'8", green. The kind of colleague who has one joke and will not be persuaded to retire it. High five. Ghost is stranger, and I'll flag it now because it comes back later when we do the theories. His real name is actually mentioned in the show as Gary in the episode, The Real Thomas. Not once across the entire run, and he barely speaks for the first 3 seasons before finally getting proper dialogue from season 4 onward, at which point he turns out to be, honestly, one of the most likeable characters in the whole thing. There's a whole essay in that. A character who is silent for 3 years, and then, once the writers finally trust him with words, becomes a favourite. That's a rare thing on any show. And then Pops, who at this stage is just the lollipop man from the student film, floating about being delighted by things. His dad is Mr. Maillard, who is the actual owner of the park, not Pops. Pops just gets treated like he owns it, which is a lovely little bit of class comedy that the show basically never draws attention to. Now here's a fun bit of production detail that I think explains a lot about why the show looks the way it does. When Quintel was building the crew, he specifically went looking for young, independent comic book artists to be his storyboard artists. Not animators, comic artists. He thought their style would match closely with what he wanted for the series. And the way he found them was gloriously low-tech. He went through blogs, he went to convention panels. He was looking for what he called the total package, which for him meant someone who could both write and draw, something a lot of independent comic artists can do by necessity, because when it's your own comic, there's nobody else to do either job. He also went to the open shows at Cal Arts, which is an 8-hour festival of student animation. 8 hours, sitting through 8 hours of student films to find people. That's commitment. And it did not go smoothly at first, which I think is worth saying because we tend to talk about these shows like they arrived fully formed. The style and sensibility of regular show was difficult to work with in the beginning. The artist struggled to create a natural sitcom-like sound for the series, which makes total sense when you think about what he was asking for. He'd hired a bunch of brilliant comic artists and then told them to make it sound like 2 blokes talking. Comics don't work like that. Comics compress. Every line has to earn its place. And regular show needed lines that didn't earn their place at all, lines that just sort of sat there, because that's how actual conversation goes. That's a hard note to give. Make it worse, but on purpose. And since we're on the subject of making it sound like people talking, we should talk about the voices, because they did something with the recording that most cartoons don't bother with. Let's do the roll call first, and then get to the interesting bit. Mark Hamill plays Skips, which is one of those pieces of casting that stops being surprising the moment you hear it, and becomes very surprising again if you think about it for more than 4 seconds. Luke Skywalker, playing a Yeti, who mows a lawn. William Soliers plays Rigby. Janie Haddad plays Margaret. Roger Craig Smith plays Thomas, and Sam Marin, Quintel's mate from Cal Arts, plays Benson and Pops and Muscle Man. I want to dwell on that for a moment, because it gets glossed over. 3 of the most distinct voices on the show are one man. Benson's clipped, permanently about to shout management voice. Pops' airy Edwardian delight. And Muscle Man's nasal, aggressive, absolutely relentless delivery. Same bloke, in the same room, presumably on the same afternoon. Quintel plays Mordecai and High Five Ghost, though not at first actually. Jeff Bennett voiced High Five Ghost in Season 1, and Quintel took over from Season 2 onward, which nobody notices because High Five Ghost is barely saying anything in Season 1 anyway. Members of the production staff turn up in the cast all over the place too. Minty Lewis, Toby Jones, Andres Salaf, and Matt Price were members of the production staff who appeared in the cast, which is a very Cartoon Network thing and a very regular show thing specifically. If you were in the building and you had a funny voice, you were probably in an episode. Mr. Maylard was played by David Ogden Stiers, a proper voice acting veteran. It marked his final recurring voice role before his death in March 2018. I won't make a thing of it because he'd probably have found that tedious, but it's worth knowing. Right. Now the actually interesting bit, which is not who was cast, but how they recorded it. The regular show cast recorded their lines together, as a group, rather than doing individual sessions for each actor. If you're not familiar with how voice acting normally works, that sentence doesn't land, so let me explain why it matters. The standard way to record an animated show is one actor at a time, alone in a booth, with a director feeding them lines. It's efficient, it's cheap. You can schedule around people. Most of the cartoons you've ever watched were made by actors who never met each other. And you can hear it. That's the thing. You can always hear it. It's why cartoon dialogue so often has that slightly hollow quality, where every line is a little bit too clean, and everyone's timing is a little bit too perfect, because nobody is actually reacting to anybody. They're reacting to a memory of a line a director read to them. Regular show didn't do that. They put everyone in the room, and this was specifically to help make the dialogue sound natural. And the intention behind the whole vocal performance was deliberate. The voice acting is low-key. The aim was to make most of the characters sound natural and conversational, and to have them not talk loudly. Not talk loudly, someone actually sat down and made that a rule. Quintel wanted to make the show listenable, and he wanted to give contrast to most other cartoons, which he noted can be difficult for adults to listen to. Now, I want to be a bit self-aware here, because this is the exact point where my personal interest in this show and the reason you're listening to me at 1 a.m. collide. That decision, made around 2010, for creative reasons, entirely unrelated to anything that would happen later, is why regular show became one of the great pieces of background telly of all time. It's why people put it on to fall asleep to. It's why it survives on second screens and in the corner of a room while you do the washing up. It's not loud, nobody's shouting at you. The performances are tired in a good way. Benson shouts. Sure, but Benson shouting is a punchline that only works because everyone else has spent 10 minutes talking at a completely normal volume. Quintel's stated goal was that adults should be able to be in the room with it without wanting to leave. He achieved that so thoroughly that a decade later it became one of the default things people fall asleep to. Nobody designed that. It's just what happens when you decide that a cartoon should sound like people. There's a small, slightly sad coda to the voice story that I really like. Quintel voiced Mordecai in the student film out of necessity. Not because he wanted to act, because there was nobody else. It's a student film, made in a weekend, out of a word in a hat. You do the voices because you are the only person there, and his mate Sam Marin voiced all the other characters, for the same reason. So the entire vocal architecture of this show is 2 skint film students who couldn't afford actors, doing all the parts themselves, and then simply never stopping. It worked, so they kept it. 10 years later, Marin is still doing 3 of the leads. Some of the best things in this industry are just somebody's temporary solution that nobody ever got round to replacing. And since we're on that exact subject, let's talk about the music. Because the most famous thing about the sound of regular show is also, technically, a placeholder that nobody removed. The main composer of regular show is Mark Mothersbaugh. If that name doesn't immediately mean anything to you, Mark Mothersbaugh is one of the founding members of Devo, the band with the red flower pot hats, the band that did Whip It. One of the strangest, most aggressively arty new wave bands of the late 70s, a group of blokes from Ohio who built an entire career around the theory that humanity was going backwards. That man wrote the music for a Cartoon Network show about a raccoon, and the way it happened was almost embarrassingly simple. As Quintel was developing the pilot, he considered asking Mothersbaugh to do the music. So they sent him the episode's animatic, along with a request that he join the show's staff and crew. And he said yes. That's the whole story. He thought, wouldn't it be cool if? And then he asked. And the man said, yes, I love that. There's no agent war. There's no bidding. Somebody had a good idea and then did the frankly radical thing of finding out. By that point, Mothersbaugh had already done a huge amount of scoring work. So it's not as though he was slumming it, but still. There's something perfect about the fact that the man who spent the 70s arguing that society was devolving ended up writing the underscore for two lads arguing about who has to do the washing up. And, as I mentioned at the top, there's no theme tune, just a blurred sound provided by Quintel himself. Then a ticking clock over the title cards. I've never fully got to the bottom of why they made that choice, and I suspect the answer is deeply boring, like they ran out of time and then everyone liked it, which is, as we're establishing, roughly how this entire show got made. Now the licensed music, because this is the bit everybody remembers, and the reason it exists is my favourite production story in the whole series. Regular Show occasionally used licensed songs, mostly from the 1980s, and the way that started was completely accidental. Quintel and the staff writers began recording the animatics using copyrighted songs for the montage scenes, which is a completely normal thing to do. Everyone does it. When you're building a rough version of a sequence, you drop in a temp track so people can feel the rhythm of it. It's understood by everyone in the room that the temp track is going in the bin. You can't afford the temp track. Nobody expects the temp track. Then the network executives watched the animatic and asked the crew if they wanted to use some of the songs in the finished episodes. That's not how this goes. That is the opposite of how this goes. Normally, the note from above is, you can't have that, it costs more than the episode. Instead, somebody at Cartoon Network watched a rough cut and said, essentially, no, that's good, keep it, we'll pay. Quintel's criteria for choosing songs was refreshingly unpretentious. They're chosen for whether they suit the scene, whether they sound good, and whether they're affordable. Whether they're affordable. There it is, the most defining sonic texture of an entire era of Cartoon Network, chosen partly on the basis of what was going cheap. And I want to point out what this actually means, because it reframes the whole nostalgia thing. Everyone talks about Regular Show's 80s needle drops like they were some carefully constructed statement about the decade. Reviewers at the time noticed the 80s nostalgia vibe and made a lot of it, and there was a fair bit of, how does a bloke in his 20s have this much 80s affection? And the answer is that nobody was making a statement about anything. They were making a rough cut, and somebody upstairs liked the rough cut. Right, the animation itself, which is genuinely a bit mad for the era. Regular Show was animated traditionally, by hand using construction paper cutouts, before it later switched to computer animation. On paper, actual paper, with our actual pencils, which was then digitally composited and painted with digital ink and paint. This is in 2010, when most modern animation had already switched to hybrid methods like the Cintiq, which is a screen you draw directly onto. Cintiqs were initially optioned for the show, and Quintel said no. He felt more comfortable working on paper, considering it more organic and more representative of each artist's individual style. The board artist Calvin Wong once described the tools of the trade on that show as pencils, pens, whiteout, and occasionally light boxes and electric erasers. Whiteout on a television show in the 2010s, there is something so pleasingly stubborn about that. A studio full of people making one of the biggest cartoons in the world with construction paper. And I think the paper decision is more important than it sounds, because of that phrase Quintel used. More representative of each artist's individual style. When you draw on paper, Your hand does what your hand does. There's a wobble to it, there's a pressure to it. Digital tools are extremely good at smoothing that out, which is usually the point. And Quintel specifically didn't want it smoothed out. Which lines up with everything else about the show, doesn't it? He kept the push-together cast, he kept the accidental temp music, he kept the wobbly lines. The whole production philosophy seems to be, leave the fingerprints on it. The pace this was all happening at is genuinely alarming. Each episode took roughly 9 months to go from idea to finished product. 9 months, and by March 2012, Quintel was directing a crew of about 35 people to make them. So at any one moment, there are episodes in every stage of that 9-month pipeline, stacked up behind each other like planes waiting to land. And one bloke in his late 20s is meant to be across all of them. Fun detail I keep coming back to. He was in his late 20s when the show was really taking off. 30, running a crew of 35, on a show he'd built out of student films he made in a weekend, using music he'd chosen partly on price, drawn on paper with Tipex. But now, let's talk about what they were actually making with all that paper, because the shape of a regular show episode is more deliberate than it looks. The structure of a regular show episode is stated pretty plainly if you go looking for it. And it's this. The plots generally begin with a basic problem that the characters have to overcome. Then, while they're working on it, a magical, supernatural, or strange element appears and complicates the initially simple problem. That's the machine. Small problem. Weird thing arrives. Small problem is now enormous. And the reason they chose that structure is the bit I like. The writers decided to follow it, specifically to take advantage of the animation. Because you can. Because it's a cartoon and nothing costs anything. So why would you write a scene where two blokes just have an argument when you could write a scene where two blokes have an argument and then the argument becomes a giant floating head? But the key word in that description is initially simple. The problem has to be genuinely, boringly small. Not a small adventure. Small. Nobody wants to hoover. Someone's eaten the last sandwich. There's a hole in the wall and Benson's going to notice. And that's why the zoo idea had to die, which I've already banged on about, so I'll leave it there. Now, the influences on the humour, which are not what you'd expect. Bill and Ted is the obvious ancestor, and it's the comparison people reach for. And they're right to. Two amiable idiots, deep affection, low stakes that keep accidentally becoming cosmic. That's the family. But the one that genuinely surprised me is this. Quintel's interest in British television was influenced by his British roommate at CalArts. That roommate introduced him to the League of Gentlemen, the IT Crowd, Little Britain, The Office, and The Mighty Boosh, which was very influential and would later feed directly into the humour in regular show. The Mighty Boosh. I need a second with that, because once you know it, you cannot unknow it. The Boosh is two mates in a low-stakes job, in this case, a zoo, funnily enough, who keep falling into surreal parallel worlds populated by extremely confident nonsense creatures who all speak in their own peculiar rhythm and never explain themselves. Vince and Howard bickering while a moon with a face talks at them. That is structurally a regular show episode. That is exactly a regular show episode. So a Cartoon Network show about American slackers has the Mighty Boosh in its bloodstream, because of who Quintel happened to be sharing a flat with at art school. If he'd had a different roommate, the show would have been a different show. That's the sort of thing that keeps me up, honestly. The whole tone of a series, decided by university accommodation allocation. Now, the pilot, which is the cleanest demonstration of the formula that exists, and which becomes weirdly important years later. It's called The Power. Mordecai and Rigby find a keyboard. The keyboard grants any wish, on the condition that you articulate the desire through an improvised song and dance routine. That's the premise. Not, you get 3 wishes, you have to sing it, and they're not good at singing. So they do what any two 20-somethings with unlimited cosmic power would do, which is faff about with it, until their much more responsible co-worker Skips starts sniffing round. And in an attempt to get rid of him, they crank the thing to maximum and sing in unison, a routine about sending him back to his place, complete with a line telling him not to look at their crotches while they synchronise their watches. And it's their best work. It's their most inspired arrangement yet. And right at the moment of triumph, they flub the lyrics, and instead of sending Skips to his room, they send him to the moon. That's episode 1. That's the whole show in 11 minutes. 2 idiots, godlike power, a rhyme, and a man on the moon. Keep that one somewhere in the back of your head. It comes back. And since we're on the subject of specific episodes, there's a lovely bit of homage worth knowing about. The entire Terror Tales of the Park series, the Halloween specials, is an open homage to The Simpsons' Treehouse of Horror. And they didn't hide it. Same idea. Both Halloween specials, both use Roman numerals, both do 3 horror segments in 30 minutes. And here's the fun detail buried in the first Halloween special. It contains at least 2 references to 2 in the AM/PM. There's a cop and there's a fart gag, both lifted from the student film, which might be because 2 in the AM/PM takes place on Halloween as well. So the Halloween special of a children's cartoon contains callbacks to an NSFW student film about a bad acid trip at a petrol station, placed there for an audience of roughly nobody, because almost no viewer could possibly have seen the source. That's not a reference for the fans. That's a reference for about 11 people who were at CalArts in 2006. I think that's the correct way to do it, honestly. Put the thing in. Don't explain it. Let it sit there for 15 years until someone digs it up. But now, let's talk about some of the actual episodes, because there are a few worth nerding out about. I'm not going to rank these, because ranking them would be exhausting, and also, I'd get it wrong, and you'd tell me so. Let's start with the awards, and let's start with a correction, because I'd rather be accurate than confident. Regular Show was nominated for 6 Emmys over its run, and won 1 in 2012 for Outstanding Short Format Animated Programme. Quintel received it as executive producer and creator. It's very widely repeated in fan circles that the winning episode was the Excellent, and it may well be, but the official record credits the show rather than the episode. So I'm going to leave that one slightly open rather than state it flatly and be wrong at you for 20 minutes. What I will say is that if it was the Excellent, that's a completely correct choice, because it's an episode where Rigby attempts to eat a comically enormous omelette to win a hat, and it becomes a story about mortality in 11 minutes, and it earns it. Also worth noting, the year before, in September 2011, while Season 3 was airing, Quintel was nominated in that same category and lost to a Disney Christmas special about elves, which is a very funny sentence, and I hope he's over it. Now, Exit 9B, which is where I'd say the show announced it had a memory. The idea that every villain the show has ever had comes back, all of them, and the Guardians of Eternal Youth turn up to help sort it out. It's the sort of episode that only works if a show has been running long enough to have a rubbish tip of discarded antagonists behind it, and Regular Show, at that point, absolutely did. There's a specific pleasure in that kind of episode that I don't think has much to do with fan service. It's more that it retroactively tells you the show was paying attention. Every stupid one-off thing you thought was disposable was apparently filed. Skip Strikes is a bowling episode, and it is stuffed with the Big Lebowski. Not gestured at, stuffed. It contains, "Yeah, that's just your opinion, man," and it has Rigby and the villains telling each other they're out of their element, which again is aimed at nobody in the audience. If you're 11, you haven't seen the Big Lebowski. You are not meant to have seen the Big Lebowski. The joke exists purely for whichever parent is half watching from the kitchen, and for the writers themselves. Sugar Rush I mostly remember as a sound. There's a point in it where these enormous blasting horns come in, and they get louder and more insistent the closer the characters get to where they're going, and the imagery starts warping around them, and the whole thing takes on this awful grinding weight, like the fabric of reality is under strain. They are buying donuts, that's the errand. Mordecai, Rigby, Skips and Pops need to replace a set of donuts and get back before Benson's meeting starts. I didn't clock what the horns were doing until years later, and then I felt quite stupid. It's Inception. The score thinks it's Christopher Nolan, and the stakes are pastry. One Pull-Up is a Rocky episode, and it's not subtle about it either. Muscle Man does the losing horns from The Price is Right when Rigby fails to do a pull-up, and then Rigby's training montage with Eileen is a straight lift. And the equipment Rigby uses to get muscles quickly is called the Russian, which is referencing Ivan Drago's training routine from Rocky IV. I want to flag the density here, rather than the individual gags, because this is a show for children on a children's network, and in a single 11-minute segment, it's referencing a 1976 boxing film, its 1985 sequel, and an American game show. None of that is explained. None of it slows down. It goes past at full speed, and if you get it, you get it. And then there's Morderby and Rigby, which ran for 8 years with well over 200 episodes, had one of the most recognisable soundtracks on TV, and yet never once got an actual theme tune, which is the one that genuinely made me sit up. That episode is named after a fan-made crossover series on YouTube called Ultimate Cartoon Fighting. An episode of that fan series had Mordecai and Rigby fuse into one being, and then immediately start arguing about what to call themselves. Morderby or Rigby, so the show named an episode after a fan video's joke. An episode of the fan series Ultimate Cartoon Fighting had Mordecai and Rigby fuse into one being and immediately start arguing over what to call themselves. But no regular show episode was ever named after that. Cartoon Network reaching down into YouTube and going, yeah, that bit was good, we'll have that. I mention it partly because it's charming and partly because it's a foreshadowing of something that happens much later, when the show gets a lot more interested in the fact that it's a show and that people watch it. Regular show was always slightly aware of its own reflection from very early on. It just didn't make a fuss about it yet. And then there's Wrap It Up, which I want to mention for a reason that has nothing to do with the episode being good, though it is. The premise is that some rappers are dissing Pops and his poems, and in the course of that, they go after everything. Their clothes, their jobs, their general uselessness. What they never once do is mention that these are not human beings. There's a bird, a raccoon, and a man with a lollipop for a head standing in front of them, and nobody thinks to bring it up, which is either a plot hole or the most disciplined joke in the whole series, depending on how charitable you're feeling. It's also, for what it's worth, a favourite piece of evidence for a certain theory we'll be getting to in a bit. Park that one. There are dozens more, and what they have in common is that bits of them broke off. Some line, some image, some 3-second reaction got detached from its episode and floated off into general circulation, and now people use it without any memory of where it came from. And I think that's the actual measure of the golden run. Not the awards, the fact that the debris lasted. But now let's talk about the Yeti, because Skips has been carrying an entirely separate television programme this whole time, and most people don't clock it. Skips is a Yeti who works at a park. He fixes things. He knows things. He is in the standard configuration of a regular show episode, the bloke you go to when it's all gone wrong, and he will sigh, and he will fix it, and he will not be thanked properly. He is also immortal, and the way the show reveals what that actually costs him is, I think, the best slow burn in the whole series. The first proper crack in it is an episode called Free Cake, which reveals that Skips has to perform a ceremonial dance every year on his birthday in order to maintain his immortality, which on the face of it is a gag. A Yeti doing a little dance. Fine, funny, move on. But sit with the implications for 2 seconds and it stops being funny. He has to do it. Every year, forever. There's no off switch. Immortality with a maintenance schedule, like a boiler. And then comes Skip's story, which is where the show quietly puts the whole thing on the table. Skips was given his immortality by the Guardians of Eternal Youth, and the reason they gave it to him was so that he could fight Clogbane. Clogbane was a bully, and during a fistfight, Clogbane inadvertently killed Skip's girlfriend, Mona. I'm going to say that again, flatly, because I think flatly is the only way to say it. His girlfriend was killed during a fight. He used it with Lego men and crude paper cutouts to create stop-motion animation. And then he took a job at a park, mowing lawns, next to two lads slacking off on the job. That is the backstory. That is the actual canonical, on-screen backstory of a supporting character in a show about avoiding work. And this is the thing about regular show that I don't think it gets enough credit for. It never announces this stuff. It doesn't sit you down. Skips doesn't get a brooding arc where he stares meaningfully at the middle distance for 6 episodes. He just gets on with it. And every so often, once a season or so, the show goes, by the way, he's been carrying this. And then it goes straight back to a fart joke. There's something almost respectful about that. Like the show understands that people who have been through the worst thing that will ever happen to them do not, generally, walk around performing it. They fix the go-kart. They tell you where the spanner is. They keep it in a box. The Guardians themselves are a wonderful bit of nonsense, and I mean that with total affection. 5 infant-like beings. Their leader is called Reginald, which we learn in an episode called Quips, and the other 3 we get names for in Skip's story: Oswald, Boswald, and Griswold. Reginald, Oswald, Boswald, and Griswold. That's the naming convention for the cosm, so these ancient cosmic entities are, from Skip's perspective, the guardians who granted him eternal youth in an ancient ritual. Skip's fists of justice, which are exactly what they sound like, and are absolutely brilliant. And here's a lovely wrinkle I only fully registered while going back through this. Skips attended school with the Guardians before they granted him his immortality. School. So these ancient cosmic entities are, from Skip's perspective, blokes he was at school with. He didn't meet them on a mountaintop after a spiritual trial. He knew them. They were in his year, which recontextualizes the annual dance somewhat. It's less eternal rite and more sorting out the paperwork with lads you've known since you were 14. The Clogbane story does eventually land, and it lands in a way that's very regular show. Mordecai and Rigby end up defeating Clogbane themselves because they accidentally injured Skips and had to step in. So the great confrontation, the thing Skips was granted eternal life for, gets handled by 2 blokes who are only there because they broke the man who was supposed to do it. It isn't clean, either. Clogbane killed Archibald, one of the Guardians, before he was sent flying off, and he vowed to return. Now, where does Skips end up? In the epilogue of the finale, we find out Skips is still working at the park, still there, still doing it. Happy about it, apparently, satisfied with his life. He's picked up a part-time job as a mechanic on the side. He's immortal. He's going to watch everybody in this show grow old and die. And what he wants to do with that is stay at the park and pick up a bit of extra work fixing cars. I actually think that's the most emotionally intelligent thing the finale does. And it does it in about 4 seconds without drawing any attention to it whatsoever. The immortal one doesn't want more. He wants this. He's found a place with people he likes and a job he's good at, and he's not going anywhere. And then, because it's regular show, they undercut it immediately with the actual funniest detail in the entire finale. In the epilogue, Skips ditches his trademark jeans for jean shorts. That's his arc. That's the character development. 25 years pass, everyone gets married, has kids, buries their friends, builds statues, and Skips, an immortal being who has walked the earth for centuries, changes into shorts. I've thought about that more than I've thought about most actual drama. It's perfect. It's the single most true-to-life detail in the whole thing, because that is exactly what happens to men after a certain point. One day the trousers go, nobody discusses it. Anyway, let's talk about the film, because that's where the show properly went for it. Regular show got a film, which is not a given. Most cartoons don't. It was the first Cartoon Network film based on one of their series since Ed, Edd n Eddy's Big Picture Show back in 2009. It was announced in February 2015 at the Cartoon Network Upfront. Quintel announced on the 11th of June 2015 via Twitter that production had been completed. A trailer showed at Comic-Con in July, then went online a couple of days later. The budget was $3 million, which for an animated feature is nothing. That's not a film budget, that's a rounding error on a film budget. And it looks great, which tells you what a room full of people who really know what they're doing can achieve when they've been working together for 5 years. There was a cost though, and it was paid by the show. The production of the film impacted the episode count of season 6, which got 32 11-minute segments instead of the usual 40. So the film is, in a very literal sense, made out of episodes that don't exist. It was released digitally on the 1st of September 2015, went to DVD on the 13th of October, and had its television premiere on the 25th of November 2015 on Cartoon Network. The events take place during season 7. Now the plot, and I'm going to tell you this at a normal pace because it's genuinely one of the most unhinged things anybody has ever put in front of children, and it deserves to be laid out plainly rather than sold to you. We open in the distant future. Rigby is leading a rebellion. His squad is Benson, Skips, High Five Ghost, Muscle Man, and Pops. They're fighting a madman named Mr. Ross, who is plotting to destroy Earth by erasing all of time. Mr. Ross' weapon is guarded by a cyborg version of Mordecai, who is estranged from Rigby over something. Mordecai and Rigby are barely convincing Benson not to fire them because they were late, because Mordecai wanted breakfast burritos. He ship. And as Rigby is about to escape into the past, Mordecai turns up and shoots him with a plasma shotgun. That's the opening of a regular show film. Everybody's dead and Mordecai has just murdered Rigby. CDIing future Rigby explains what's happened, which is this. Back in high school, Mordecai and Rigby helped Mr. Ross build a time machine. Voy wanted breakfast burritos. That cut. That is the show in one edit. Cosmic Apocalypse, that their science teacher, who also worked as a plutonium chef, Mr. Ross, was actually responsible for the incident and sent to prison. IP crashes in the park. Dying future Rigby explains what's happened, which is this. Back in high school, Mordecai and Rigby built a time machine. It backfired and created a time-nado, a tornado that can travel through space and time. Their science teacher, who was also the volleyball coach, Mr. Ross, was held responsible for the incident and sent to prison. In the future, he's harnessed and weaponized the thing to erase everything. So the villain of the film is a bloke who lost his job over a school science project going wrong. And Mordecai explains early on that they built the time machine because Mordecai got into their dream college university, and Rigby didn't. Bai tells his present self that he'll soon have to reveal a secret from his past to save the universe, even if it destroys his friendship with Mordecai. And here's the secret, which is the entire heart of the thing. Mordecai explains early on that they built the time machine because Rigby got into their dream college university, and Mordecai didn't. That's the version they've both been living with for years. That's not what happened. Rigby never got into college university. Mordecai did. And Rigby, unwilling to be separated from him, forged Mordecai's rejection letter. Read that again. He didn't cheat to get in. He cheated to keep his mate out. That's the actual crime. That's what the whole film has been walking toward. It's not a heist or a betrayal for money or power. It's a 19-year-old who who was so frightened of being left behind that he quietly sabotaged the best thing that ever happened to his best friend, and then said nothing about it for years while they both worked minimum wage at a park. When it comes out, Mordecai ends the friendship. Properly. Blames him for holding him back the entire time. And, yes, that's a completely reasonable response. That's what it did. I think this is the smartest thing a regular show ever wrote, and here's why. The whole show, up to that point, has been built on this lovely idea that these two lads are best mates, and that's just a fact of the universe. And the film goes, right, but why are they both still here? Why is a bloke who's clearly bright still mowing a lawn at 23? And the answer is that somebody was scared. That's not a cartoon plot. That's a real thing that happens to real friendships, at a smaller scale, all the time. Somebody holds somebody back, out of love, and it takes years to notice. The film gets them back, obviously. Future Mordecai has a change of heart and takes a volleyball bomb intended for his younger self, which is a sentence I stand by. Rigby, after a truly grim detour where he attempts to fly into the sun, meets Father Time, who is falling apart because of the Time Nardo, and who convinces him to go and apologise. They beat Ross, they destroy the Time Nardo, and then they do the thing that actually fixes it, which isn't the punching. They go back and convince past Rigby to apologise to past Mr. Ross before he gets arrested, which is what Ross wanted from the start. That's it. That's the whole feud, resolved by someone saying sorry to a teacher. Back in the present, Mordecai and Rigby agree that however cool their future selves turned out, they're not letting their friendship degrade into trying to kill each other, which erases their dead future selves from the timeline. And then the last gag. Benson catches them out of the park, and they race back in the time ship from a fast food place, delighted because they'll never be late again. They have a time machine. They've saved the universe, and what they're going to use it for is getting away with being late. Jason Mantzoukas plays Mr. Ross, which is perfect casting, because Mantzoukas' whole register is a man who is slightly too intense about something that doesn't matter. Fred Tatasciore does Father Time. Mothersbaugh scored it alongside John Enroth and Albert Fox. One honest note, if you go looking for box office figures on this film, you will find wildly different numbers on different sites, some of them clearly invented. I'm not going to quote any because I don't trust them, and I'd rather say, I don't know, than make something up at you while you're trying to sleep. But now, let's talk about the other thing that film is quietly about, which is Mordecai being catastrophically bad at his own life, because the romance plot in this show is a whole saga. In season 1, Mordecai fancies Margaret, who works at the coffee shop. That's a fixture. That's practically furniture. He goes to the coffee shop, he does not say the thing, he leaves, Rigby takes the mick. And that ran and ran and ran in the way these things do on television, until eventually the show had to decide whether it was going to be honest about it or not. And what I find genuinely interesting about regular show is that it chose honest, and honest turned out to be quite unpleasant, and it committed anyway. The centrepiece is an episode called Dumped at the Altar, and it's Muscle Man's wedding day. Mordecai is with CJ at this point, and the fallout from Margaret's confession is still hanging over everything, and everyone is stressed, and Muscle Man won't go through with the ceremony without his dad's wedding day letter. And into all of this walks Mordecai, who decides that the correct venue for sorting out his own relationship is somebody else's wedding. He gets up, he makes a speech, he says he doesn't know who his soulmate is, and CJ cuts him off. She tells him to save it because she knows what he's going to say. Then he says he doesn't know who his soulmate is, and he doesn't even point in her direction, and she looks devastated. She gives him back the charm bracelet he'd given her in real date, and she runs off crying. Later, Rigby sees the two of them saying goodbye amicably, and Mordecai tells him they're taking a break for a while. Muscle Man calls him out for hijacking the wedding to ramble about his relationship problems, which, thank you Muscle Man. Starla also calls him out, though mostly so they can wrap it up and get the fryers on, which is a joke I think about more than I should. The episode isn't a disaster. Muscleman and Starla get married. Mordecai and Rigby find the letter, and there's a genuinely lovely reveal that Rigby and Eileen have been happily dating for a while, and Mordecai simply hadn't noticed, because he was busy. That's a properly good joke, that. The bloke who has made his own love life everybody's problem for 6 seasons has failed to notice that his best friend, who he sees every waking hour, has been in a relationship. And then the finale tells you where it all lands, and this is where the internet caught fire. Mordecai doesn't end up with Margaret. Mordecai doesn't end up with CJ. Mordecai marries a bat, specifically a bat artist named Steph, who we have essentially never met. And word of God confirmed that he and CJ never reconciled, and that she'd basically cut ties with him and everyone else after the breakup. Rigby married Eileen. They had kids. That one landed exactly as everyone wanted. Now, the reaction. And it is still years later. Absolutely live. Go and read a regular show thread anywhere, and you'll find people who have not let this go and are not going to. There's a whole strand of the audience for whom this is a genuine grievance. CJ deserved better is basically a standing position. A lot of people will tell you flatly that Mordecai did her dirty, and it spoiled the rest of the show for them. One fan comment I read while going through all this has stuck with me, because it might be the most accurate thing anyone has said about it. Maybe it was better to disappoint all the fans instead of just some, and I want to be honest about where I land, because I think both halves of this are correct at the same time. I think the ending is right. I think it's the only ending that's consistent with what the show had been saying for 8 years. Mordecai was not ready. He was demonstrably, repeatedly, catastrophically not ready. He hijacked a wedding. He couldn't answer a simple question about his own feelings while standing in front of the person he was in a relationship with. That's not a man who gets the girl. That's a man who needs about 6 more years and possibly some professional help. And putting him with either of them would have said something I don't think is true, which is that if you wait long enough and remain in proximity to someone, it works out. It doesn't. That's not a thing. Most of the people you agonize over in your 20s become people you don't speak to. And that's not a tragedy. It's just Tuesday. But I also think the anger is right. Because CJ was great. She was genuinely great. She was funny. She was patient. She was more interesting than the plot required her to be. And she got treated as an obstacle in someone else's growth. And the audience noticed. And then the show gave the reward to a character we didn't know, which felt, from the outside, like a shrug. So I'm on both sides. The writing was correct and the feeling was correct. Those things can sit next to each other. Sort of like how you can know perfectly well that an ex-partner was completely wrong for you and still be annoyed about how it ended 15 years later, at a wedding, after 2 drinks. But now, let's talk about how the whole thing wrapped up, because the last season of this show went somewhere nobody was expecting. The 8th and final season was branded Regular Show in Space, which is a very old and very honest move. When a sitcom sends everyone to space, it usually means the writers have run the ordinary premise into the ground and want a new sandbox. Most shows do it, and it's the death rattle. Regular Show did it, and it was, weirdly, one of the strongest things it ever did. Partly because the show had spent 7 years earning the right to just do whatever it liked, and partly because they used the space thing to get at something they'd clearly been chewing on for a while. Because Season 8 got... There's a character called Streaming, with Streambox bot minions in Regular Show rather than South Park Toan, named, obviously, after Nielsen ratings, the American system that decides whether a show lives or dies. So they went to space and put the thing that could cancel them on the map as a planet. And then they had the crew literally fight the streaming era. Not a metaphor, an actual antagonist. There's a character called Streaming with Streambox bot minions. I want to be clear. A regular epic final battle, parts 1, 2 and 3, form the 3-part series finale. Physically fight Streaming. A cartoon on a cable network. in its last season, going out swinging at the thing that was in the process of eating cable networks. That's not subtext, that's a bloke shouting from a window. Right, the finale. A regular epic final battle, parts 1 and 2, plus an episode called The Power, form the 3-part series finale. It aired on the 16th of January 2017. 1.33 million viewers watched part 1. 1.37 million watched parts 2 and 3, which made it the most watched episode of Season 8. The setup in Lollyland. The park crew arrive and meet some Lollyland natives who explain what Pops actually is, and it is not what anyone had guessed. Pops is the perfect creation of the planet. His proper name is Megacranus, and Anti-Pops was created as his opposite, Malum Cranus, to maintain balance in the universe. The natives show the crew ancient tapestries of the previous battles between the two brothers. Previous plural. This has happened before, repeatedly, and every single one of those battles ended in a stalemate, and every stalemate resulted in the universe resetting. And on those tapestries, fighting alongside Pops, our prior Inca Rigby's plan, being Rigby, is to cheat. Rop on you in a children's cartoon, so let me lay out what it actually means. Mordecai and Rigby have done this before. Not these Mordecai and Rigby, other ones. Versions of them in previous universes, standing next to previous versions of Pops losing. The show has been running on a loop that predates the show. Mordecai's plan, being Mordecai, is to cheat, set traps for anti-Pops, give Pops an advantage he's never had in any previous cycle. Pops agrees, reluctantly, because Pops does not want to fight his brother at all. He never has. That's the whole problem. And then the battle, which is where the show cashes in 8 years of nonsense at once. Everybody comes back. Every character from every corner of the run turns up to fight. HD DVD. Blu-ray, The Baby Ducks. Toothpick Sally. Recap, Robot. Death, Party Horse. The Guardians of Eternal Youth. The Guardian of Lollyland, who is explicitly supposed to remain neutral and turns up anyway. Chance Sure Shot, whose earlier death is retconned in the most regular show way imaginable, which is that it was a clone. They all merge into a giant Megazord-style robot. And I have to point out the date, because it delights me every single time. This is January 2017. Avengers, Endgame, with its enormously celebrated everyone comes through the portals moment. Cam Anti-Pops erases everyone, except Mordecai, Rigby and Pops, and kicks his brother into a portal alley channel, more than 2 years earlier, and turned them all into a Megazord while they were at it. A regular, epic final battle. Same episode, Hen Anti-Pops assumes his Titan form and starts erasing Lollyland anyway. And when Muscle Man and High Five Ghost get erased, Pops goes Titan too. Anti-Pops erases everyone except Mordecai and Rigby and kicks his brother into a portal. And then part 3 begins. And part 3 begins precisely like the first episode of Season 1. The Power, same episode. Time has apparently reset, exactly like every previous cycle. Rigby gets deja vu, and Rigby, of all of them, remembers. Rigby remembers the whole series, almost immediately. Mordecai doesn't. Mordecai has no idea what he's on about, until Rigby digs up the stash of Blu-rays they'd buried in an earlier episode, called Cheer Up Pops. And Mordecai touches them, and it all comes back. That is the first magical object in the entire series. The one they used to send skips to the moon by accident is destroyed in the first episode, having finally been used for something that mattered, Dolly from episode 1, to take themselves to the future and back to the battle. Anti-Pops attacks, destroying the power in the process, which is a hell of a thing quietly. The first magical object in the entire series, the one they used to send skips to the moon by accident, is destroyed in the last episode, having finally been used for something that mattered. And Pops works it out, through flashbacks to the earlier parts, and to an episode called Kill 'Em with Kindness, he realises that fighting anti-Pops will inevitably lead to another stalemate. That's what a stalemate is, that's what balance means. If he fights, they both lose, and everything resets, and they do it again in 1 billion years, forever. So he does something different, and it costs him his life. Pop sacrifices himself, the universe survives, and that's that. I'm not going to over-egg it, because the show doesn't either. It's handled quite quietly for what it is. Then the epilogue, which is the bit people actually talk about. Mordecai becomes an artist, gets married, has several kids. Rigby, who is always desperate to point out that he finished high school, gets a job outside the park and marries Eileen, and they have kids too. High Five Ghost becomes a DJ, which is exactly right, and I won't hear otherwise. Benson keeps running the park with a new crew, and the only familiar face on it is Skips, who we've covered. Muscle Man goes home and discovers he has a 3-year-old daughter, which is played as a joke and is also, if you think about it for 1 second, an entire other show. A statue of Pops goes up in the middle of tea, and they decide, instead of working, to go and play some old arcade games in the shed. I put up a second statue next to it for the now deceased Mr. Maillard and take a photo in front of it with their families. And then Mordecai and Rigby, who are now 54 years old, go and reminisce about what they used to do, about how they used to behave, and they decide, to remember the good times, to go and play some old arcade games in the shed. They do their catchphrases, and they laugh about how immature they used to be. 2 men in their 50s at a party sneaking off to play video games in a shed. If that doesn't get you, I don't know what to tell you. And it turns out the title is a physical object in the hands of Mordecai and Rigby, and it's the tape of their memories in the frame. Pops is watching all of this. They built up to it over the final season and then brought it in at the end. Regular. That's where the TV show stopped for 9 years. S for 8 years. A shrug of a joke about how nothing in it was regular. And it turns out the title is a physical object in the hands of a dead man, and it's the thing you've been watching this whole time. They never hinted at it. They never set it up. They just walked in at the end and put it on the table. Anyway, that's where it stopped for 9 years. But now let's talk about the theories, because a show like this collects them, and a few of them are considerably better than they have any right to be. Right, 4 of these, they're not in order of quality and they're not building to anything. They're just 4 ideas that have followed this show around, and I've got opinions about all of them. So, the acid trip theory. The strongest version of this one goes, the entire series is a shared hallucination between Benson and Mordecai, who are really 2 human, drug-abusing clerks working at a petrol station. Some versions go further and say, in this theory, we see it from their point of view, which is why he's still a gumball machine. Film. Skips is the dealer, Margaret's an ex. Muscle Man and High Five Ghost are stoners who. There is an actual student film in which Mordecai and Benson are literally acid hallucinations, experienced by 2 clerks voiced by Quintel, and Sam Maroney. Everyone else is chilled out, and we see it from their point of view, which is why he's still a gumball machine. And the evidence people cite for this is not nothing, which we've already established. There is an actual student film in which Mordecai and Benson are literally acid hallucinations, experienced by 2 clerks drawn to look like Quintel and Marin. People point at other things too. The rappers in Wrap It Up, which we've already been through. That the surreal imagery in a lot of episodes resembles a psychedelic trip. That Mordecai and Rigby behave exactly like stoners, sitting on a sofa, playing video games, laughing at nothing, eating constantly, while almost everyone else in the show is productive. Here's my honest read, and I've gone back and forth on it. This is simultaneously the best founded and the worst argued theory in cartoons. The premise is real, which is what makes it so sturdy. Every other cartoon theory starts with someone squinting at a background detail. This one starts with an actual film you can watch, but the conclusion doesn't follow, and it doesn't follow for a boring structural reason. That short predates the show's conception. Quintel didn't make a show about the world of 2 in the AM/PM. He raided it. He liked the designs. He didn't want to spend another year making new ones, so he reused them. That's not a hidden prequel. That's a bloke going through his own back catalogue, because character design is slow. The theory is reading a supply decision as a story decision. And it's a shame in a way, because if you strip out the "it's all drugs" bit, there's something genuinely true underneath it. The show does feel like that. The rhythm of it, the way an ordinary afternoon curdles into something enormous and then snaps back with no consequences, is absolutely the rhythm of the short film it came from. Quintel told Rob Sausher he wanted to make something with that vibe, that intensity, that surreal nature, pushed, which makes the show's present, roughly, 2010, asked for. So the theory is right about the feeling and wrong about the fact, which is a very common thing with these, actually. Right, the 2005 theory. This one's quiet, and I like it a great deal. In Prank Callers, they travel to the past, and the most recent year shown is 2004, which makes 20, according to this theory. It's not a cartoon set in a vague present. Roughly, 2005. And 2005 is the year J.G. Quintel was 23 years old. Mordecai and Rigby are 23. That's stated. That's a fact of the show. That's it. That's the whole theory. No twist, no darkness, nobody secretly dead. Just arithmetic. And what it produces, if it's true, is that regular show is a period piece. It's not a cartoon set in a vague present. It's a show set in the exact year its creator was. But if regular show is set in 2005, then those references aren't the show being nostalgic. Fin regular show. It's the characters being nostalgic. Ears. Which explains something that otherwise doesn't quite add up. All those 80s references get called nostalgia, and people found it slightly odd that a bloke in his 20s had that much affection for a decade he barely saw. But if the show is set in 2005, then those references aren't the show being nostalgic. They're the characters being nostalgic. That's what people that age were actually doing in 2005, digging up their parents' records and their older brothers' games and deciding they were better than anything current. I don't know if it's true. It might be a coincidence about a year on a screen, but it's the only theory in this section that makes the show make more sense rather than less. And that's rare enough that I'll take it. Most of them are ghosts. High five. Ghost? Nobody has ever answered this one, and I think that's on purpose. The question is simply, what is he? He's a ghost. Ghosts, as a rule, used to be something. So what was he before he died? The show gives you nothing. It gives you less than nothing. It gives you, see you there, where we meet his family. And they're ghosts as well. All of them. Which doesn't clarify anything, it makes it worse, because now it's hereditary. And being a ghost isn't supposed to be hereditary. So the theories fork. One says he's not a ghost in the conventional sense at all. He's a spectre, a separate thing, its own species, which would explain the family. One says he might not be supernatural at all and could be an extraterrestrial. And one, which I have a soft spot for, says he genuinely is a ghost, a dead person. And the only reason he never crossed over is that he's linked to Muscle Man. The evidence for that last one is a Tarot. The show ran for 8 seasons, gave High Five Ghost more regular dialogue in its later seasons, gave him a girlfriend and a DJ career, and still never clearly explained what he is, in any meaningful sense, but it is the only time the show has ever put the two of them, and an afterlife, in the same frame. I'm not going to pick one, and I'd be suspicious of anyone who does. The show ran for 8 seasons, gave him proper dialogue for 5 of them, gave him a family, gave him a career as a DJ, and never once told you his name, or what he is. He's the only main character whose real name is never mentioned. That's a decision. Somebody kept making that decision year after year, And I think the answer is that it's funnier if you never find out. And then the afterlife theory and what just happened to it. This one has always been the messiest because for most of the show's life it was a vibe rather than an argument. The general shape of it is that the park isn't a place, that it's some kind of holding pattern, an afterlife, a purgatory, a thing being observed, that there's a reason these characters never age and never leave and can't die properly, and that reason is that something is already over. And for years there was no evidence for it beyond the general feeling of the thing. And then the finale ended with Pops in a heaven, watching his friends on a tape called Regular Show, which doesn't confirm the theory, not remotely. But it does put a very specific idea in front of you, that everything you have watched exists inside the fiction as an object, that it was recorded, that someone is watching it. Now, here's why we're talking about this in 2026 rather than 2017. The revival's premiere opens with Pops in heaven. He's having, apparently, the time of his afterlife, doing whatever made him happiest in life. We see Anti-Pops, who has changed his ways. We see Mr. Maillard. We see a great many characters who did not survive the original run, all of them there. And Pops is watching a tape of his own life, which he has been doing routinely, because revisiting Mordecai and Rigby's antics has become a big part of his afterlife, and he destroys it, by accident, which sends him into a spiral. So the framing device of the entire It's a Comedy about a blue jay and a raccoon rewatching is a tape that a dead man is watching, and has been watching, constantly. I want to be careful here, because it would be very easy to oversell this, and I'd rather not lie to you at 1 a.m. This is not a confirmation. Nobody has come out and said the park is purgatory. The show is not admitting anything. It's a comedy about a raccoon. But I'll say this much. The people who spent a decade insisting the park was some kind of afterlife and getting laughed at for it were reading the right author. Whatever else is true, Quintel's instinct, when handed the ending of his own show, was to put the whole thing on a tape in the hands of the dead. And then, given the chance to come back, his instinct was to open with that same dead man, in the same afterlife, watching the same tape. That's twice now. That's a pattern, not an accident. The theory people didn't get it right, but they weren't wrong about what kind of show this was. But now, let's talk about the revival properly, because it's the newest part of this story, and it's genuinely strange that it exists at all. On the 12th of June 2024, Warner Bros. Discovery announced that a new regular show series had been greenlit. 1 season. Quintel returning as showrunner. It was announced at the Annecy Animation Film Festival, which is a nice touch because Annecy is where Quintel had done press for the original show years earlier. It's called Regular Show, The Lost Tapers. The way it came about is very undramatic, which by now will not surprise you. In early 2024, Quintel was working at Cartoon Network Studios developing Super Mutant Magic Academy for Adult Swim. And Lauren Martinez, then the vice president for series at the studio, approached him and asked if he'd like to bring back a regular show. That's it, somebody asked him. Same as the Mother's Ball thing. Somebody had the idea and then simply said it out. 10 episodes were ordered. Burr 2024, Mark Hamill confirmed he'd be back as Skips. And then the rest came. William Saliers, Sam Marin, Minty Lewis, Janie Haddad-Tompkins. Sean Seales returned as executive producer alongside Quintel. It premiered globally on the 11th of May 2026 with a half-hour special. It went to HBO Max and Hulu in the States in June. 40 episodes were ordered. 10 went out first, 30 scheduled for later. Now the conceit, which is quite clever and quite frustrating in equal measure. The lost tapes are new adventures, set ambiguously inside the timeline of the original series. Not after it, inside it, which means they can go back to disconnected episodic stories without dragging along the continuity and without having to tamper with the ending. Quintel has said he wants to give more attention to the side characters. His line was that beyond Margaret and Eileen, there'll be other characters getting their own episodes here and there. And the reception has been, honestly, mixed. I'm going to give you both sides of that because I'd rather you had the real picture. IndieWire didn't like the premiere much. They found neither half particularly strong, called them frantic and poorly paced, and said they lacked the contrast between the chill, down-to-earth characters and the absurdity around them that gave the series its original hook. Though they did single out one killer joke about Hall & Oates as evidence the juice hasn't fully run out. Discussing Film went further, and their criticism is the one I keep chewing on. They said the lost tapes is missing the sense of time and place that made the original feel so specific, that Quintel had drawn on the slacker comedy genre and responded to the world around him, capturing a very particular millennial malaise in the early 2010s, and that in trying to recapture that same mood, the revival feels untethered. Less like a period piece, more like a late-season Simpsons episode. Fanboy factor was warmer. They watched 2 episodes and found the chemistry between the cast still felt natural, as if no time had passed. They noted the format is the same, normal descending into chaos, and that the writing is what you'd expect from a regular show episode, which is good. Their qualification was that it doesn't do much to evolve beyond what the original already established. And there was a lovely observation floating around from critics who saw the preview episodes, which is that some of the stories feel like close enough episodes that never got made, repackaged for regular show. Right. My honest opinion, I don't think a revival was ever going to catch that specific mood from 2011. And I don't think that's a writing failure. I think that's just time passing. Because discussing film's criticism is correct and also unfixable. Yes, the original was about a very particular feeling of being 23 and broke and slightly adrift in a specific economic moment. Of course it was. It was made by a man who had just been that, in a country that had just had a crash, aimed at people who were about to be it. That's not a technique. You can't do that on purpose. It's what happens when someone makes a thing while the thing is still happening to them. Asking a man in his 40s to recreate that is asking him to be 23 again. Sort of like how you can go back to the pub you used to go to, and it's the same pub, and the drinks are the same, and it isn't the same at all, and that's nobody's fault. There's also something genuinely interesting going on underneath it, which the reviews are mostly not picking up. The opening segment reads, "To a fair few people," as Quintel commenting on streaming, which lands harder when you know that his next show, Close Enough, got pulled from HBO Max. It's now difficult to watch legitimately at all, so a bloke whose last show was removed from the internet has come back with a show whose entire premise is that the episodes are on physical tapes and one of them has been destroyed and can't be recovered. That's not subtle, and the opening apparently sets up an arc for the whole season, heading toward an episode called The Ultimate Format War, which, if it's anything like the format war stuff in the original, should be V, and they kept banging out season after season after season, then a movie, then one last season, 2, and it's got nothing to do with whether the new episodes are good. He said that a lot of them didn't realise what they had when they were on regular show. The first season was 12 episodes. Then the network said, do 28 more. And after that, it was 40. And they kept banging out 40 after 40 after 40. Then a movie, then 40 more. For a lot of that crew, that was almost 10 years straight, with small hiatuses where you always knew you had something to come back to. And his contrast with how it works now is bleak. 10 episodes, then wait until it streams to see if it's got numbers, then we'll call you back. Except by then everybody's already found other jobs, so you have to gear up a whole other crew and retrain them every time. That's the thing, isn't it? That's what everyone's actually mourning. It was never really about a raccoon. It was about a building where a group of people got to work together for 10 years and got good at it, and that arrangement doesn't exist anymore. He also said that the reason he did it was that after the pandemic, going out more, running into people, he realised how many people had watched the show. He'd be ordering a burger and the bloke behind the counter would say, "Are you JG Quintel? It's free." He met kids who weren't even born when it came out, telling him it's their favourite show ever. He said, "And I love this. Man, people really like it. 30 years in animation, and that's the reaction. Genuine surprise. Animation is definitely for shy people," he said, and he prefers to recede into the darkness when it comes to BA show that never introduced itself. Made by a bloke from a flat town who got into art school on his second go. Built out of drawings he already had, because making new ones takes ages, scored partly on the basis of what was affordable. Drawn on paper with Tipex by a crew he found through industry connections and schools. Raise the Noise and The Clock. That's what I keep coming back to. A show that never introduced itself, made by a bloke from a flat town who got into art school on his second go. Built out of drawings he already had, because making new ones takes ages. Scored partly on the basis of what was affordable, drawn on paper with Tipex, by a crew he found on blogs. And it ran for the better part of a decade, and it's one of the best things anyone did that decade. None of it was planned. That's what I find so cheering about the whole story, honestly. There's no genius moment. There's no visionary staring out of a window. There's a hat with words in it, and a post-it with a raccoon on it, and a man who liked a Sega game about two aliens wandering about doing nothing much. And it ended properly, which almost nothing does. It ended with a man in his 50s sneaking off to a shed to play arcade games, and a statue in a park, and a bloke in jean shorts who's going to be there forever. And then it turned out the whole thing was a tape, which, as of about 2 months ago, is playing again. Somewhere up there, Pops is still watching. That's a genuinely strange sentence to be able to say in 2026, and I'm quite fond of the fact that I can. I've got a few more of these planned. There's a whole video in Adventure Time, and the same building and the same people, if that's something you'd want. But that's the story. That's regular show. Thanks for keeping me company. Night.